Welcome, Mirbatas, to our survey of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov and his role in art music for the holidays. I am your host, Tristan Andrew. We will start our survey with some famous works we can link to Halloween, including a famous tribute to Rimsky-Korsakov's deceased friend, Modest Mussorgsky. His orchestration of Night on Bald Mountain. Prepare for some tricks and treats as we begin our long journey. This is the first in a series of presentations looking at Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, his music, his orchestral mastery, and his influence on Western art music through decades of teaching at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. As always, I will be approaching this topic from the perspective of holiday music. Today's subject is Halloween, a holiday for which there is almost no directly related art music. However, recognizing that there are many concepts that we regularly associate with Halloween, such as death, destiny, doomed love, and other aspects of high drama, and of course, all things supernatural, it is obvious that a great deal of art music through the ages can be linked to this dark, delicious holiday. This is definitely the case for music by Rimsky-Korsakov and some of his students. Nikolai Andreevich Rimsky-Korsakov, born in 1844 and dying in 1908, was a member of the Five, a group of Russian composers who worked together to create a distinct national style of art music in St. Petersburg from 1856 through the 1870s. Sometimes called the Mighty Handful, the Five consisted of, in addition to Rimsky-Korsakov, the leader, Mily Balakirev, Cesar Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, and Alexander Borodin. Rimsky-Korsakov was a master of orchestration, and it was his skill with what had become known as the cosmopolitan style that allowed him to introduce more Russian cultural elements. His best-known orchestral compositions, the Spanish Capriccio, the Russian Easter Overture, and the symphonic suite Scheherazade, are staples of the Arts Music playlist, along with suites and excerpts from some of his 15 operas. Scheherazade is an example of his frequent use of fairy tale and folk subjects. Now, here are a few thoughts on Scheherazade. Scheherazade's gorgeous melodies and vast, impeccably employed palette of orchestral colors have made it Rimsky-Korsakov's most iconic work. His vision for this symphonic suite from 1888, inspired by The 1001 Nights, was a narrative about the tales Sultana Scheherazade told over time to save herself from a brooding sultan, Shahryar, convinced of all women's infidelity. In later years, he promoted an unspecified Oriental program. Clearly, his vision would be hard to work into our Halloween themes. Whilst Mikhail Fokine and Leon Bakst's ballet version from 1910, dramatizing just how Sultan Shahryar came to distrust women, might hint at Halloween through the ending massacre and suicide, this survey is keeping the focus on the composer, his orchestrations, and his students, not what later artists would do with it. So, beyond tipping our hat to Scheherazad's beauty, it won't be discussed further here. Rimsky-Korsakov left a considerable body of original Russian compositions. He prepared works by the Five for performance, which brought them into the active art music playlist, and shaped a generation of younger composers and musicians during his decades as an educator. Rimsky-Korsakov is therefore considered the main architect of what the art music public considers the Russian style. I've already mentioned one of his holiday works, the Russian Easter Overture, but my focus here is on Halloween. It is not surprising that Rimsky-Korsakov's Halloween music is also intrinsically Russian. Thanks to his genius, he also saw to it that other Russian music would receive international spotlight. The heart of Russian music is dance, mythology, and religion. It can be said that Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's dance rhythms first powered a Russian musical awakening. Another vital element may have been a renewed interest in Russia's own religious and cultural heritage. This would change forever melody and harmony, not just in Russia, but in all Western art music. Starting in the 1880s, a new breed of composers turned their attention away from the musical traditions of Western Europe and towards their own, including the folk songs and even the folk tales that enrich Slavic culture. The Mighty Five led the way. Composer and musicologist Howard Goodall describes how the centuries-old Russian Orthodox chants, with their deep basses and thick 8 or 16 voice block chords, an ancient sound known as znameny chant, was to flow like a river into the choral texture of all Russian composers. Rimsky-Korsakov's Halloween music includes both his own compositions and his orchestration of a work by another member of the Five, Modest Mussorgsky. It was Modest Mussorgsky who was the first to use the colors, voices, and glittering effects, tolling bells, and echoing orchestra chimes of traditional Russian music in ways that inspired his compatriots to turn away from the musical architecture of Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. Mussorgsky incorporated what to Western ears were weird scales, jingly-jangly sounds, and block chords in his pieces to create something startling, new, and exciting. When his compatriot and friend Rimsky-Korsakov would later mine the golden seam of Slavic folklore in a series of operatic pageants put on around the turn of the century, he would also remember his debt to his friend by orchestrating one of Mussorgsky's own works. Like Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov didn't just use folk stories in his plots. Crucially, he also started to borrow the melodic building blocks of Russian folk music. He was the master of using the octatonic scale to suggest the exotic, and not just the East, but the supernatural as well. Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain was inspired by Russian literary works and legend. The title alone suggests a landscape haunted by the supernatural, and it is an obvious component of any Halloween playlist. Night on Bald Mountain was based on a legend from the story collection Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka by Ukrainian author Nikolai Gogol regarding a witch's Sabbath under deity Chernobog, taking place on St. John's Eve, 23rd to 24th of June, on the Lisa Hore Bald Mountain near Kyiv in Ukraine. With Rimsky-Korsakov's Sadko of 1867, Night on Bald Mountain is one of the first tone poems by a Russian composer. Although Mussorgsky was proud of his 1867 effort, his mentor, Mily Balakirev, refused to perform it. Despite 2 more attempts with the music, it was never performed in any form during Mussorgsky's lifetime. In 1886, 5 years after Mussorgsky's death, Rimsky-Korsakov published an arrangement of the work described as a fantasy for orchestra. Some scholars consider this version to be an original composition of Rimsky-Korsakov using Mussorgsky's last version of the music. It must be said that it was Rimsky-Korsakov's version that became a concert favorite. The early significance of this work is its purely Russian use of rhythms, harmonics, and unabashed celebration of Slavic mythology. Rimsky-Korsakov was a master orchestrator, well versed in cosmopolitan traditions, but his own Russian sensibility allows Mussorgsky's haunting nationalism to shine through. Ha 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 ha. Mussorgsky's tone poem was not published in its original form until 1968. Although rarely performed, it has started to become familiar to modern audiences. Half a century later, the American Disney animated film Fantasia from 1940 featured an arrangement by Leopold Stokowski, based on Rimsky-Korsakov's version. Whilst the bulk of the piece is dark, it ends with the creatures banished by the light, and a segue into Franz Schubert's Ave Maria, rendering the whole as family-friendly. There is no better illustration of how Russia's musical nationalism came to be embraced by the West. This marriage of different musical traditions from different cultures and musical styles, classical with late Romanticism, also demonstrates how the expectations of composers can be completely overset by changing public tastes, often to their betterment. Under Rimsky-Korsakov's pen, Night on Bald Mountain has come to represent all that is most exciting and yet still essentially safe for Halloween-related art music. Given what he was able to achieve with Mussorgsky's unpolished melodies and chord structures, it is not surprising that he would be able to take other Russian folk tales and create additional art music we can enjoy for Halloween. One such example, Night on Mount Triglav, comes from his opera Mlada. In 1892, Rimsky-Korsakov wrote the opera ballet Mlada, a fantasy tale about ancient pagan Slavs, using methods he had first heard in Richard Wagner's four-part operatic Norse Edda, The Ring of the Nibelung. Particularly the leitmotifs and extravagant orchestration. In his memoirs, he reported that at the first concert of the third act, my orchestral contrivances hit the mark, and the succession of the fantastic coloring of the afterworld, of the flight of shadows, and of Mlada's appearance, of the hellishly ominous appearance of Chernobog, of Cleopatra's Oriental Bacchanal, and of Day Awakening with the Birds, produced a deep impression. Despite initial success, Mlada faded fast in the esteem of both critics and the public. Remembering his acclaimed orchestration of Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, Rimsky-Korsakov noted that the third act of his Mlada used a similar setting and supernatural elements. He determined to give this act new life by making an orchestral arrangement of it as well. Night on Mount Triglav debuted at a charity concert in 1901 for widows and orphans of artists and musicians in Moscow. It is a work of scene painting, with the long introduction depicting the starry night on the mountain, with subsequent scenes of ghosts, witches, and demons. In this form, the work enjoyed great success when impresario Sergei Diaghilev included it in his Paris season of 1907. before the Ballet Russe began. Night on Mount Triglav starts in a darkening dream with woodwinds, playing very high sustained notes that contrast with a slow, tonally ambiguous churning in the strings. A dance for ghosts, ronde fantastique, played on a flute that continually modulates from minor to major, hints at the strangeness to come. A long yearning cello melody evokes Prince Yaromir, following Princess Mlada up the mountain and begging to be allowed to come along with her into the spirit world. Then a short, sharp scene dominated by brass introduces the Ronde Infernale, a dance for the monsters that surround the demon Chernobog. This starts with a demonic trill in the strings that picks up speed and agitation until Chernobog himself enters, introduced from afar by menacing, widely spaced brass chords and a long, tense timpani crescendo. Morena, goddess of the underworld, makes a plea to draw Yaromir's attentions to another, delivered with chirping woodwinds over low horns and double bass chords that switch the mode from major to minor, an effect both luminous and ominous. Gastier the Deathless then conjures a vision of Cleopatra with an extravagant oriental melody filled with seductive accidentals and lavish sprays of notes, and played on a panpipe. A crowing cock, represented by the oboe, wakes Yaromir up, and with heroic brass backing him, he resolves to make sense of this vivid, strange dream. Russian folklore has proven to be endlessly inspirational. A fascinating historical note is that Igor Stravinsky, the most radical of Russian composers, borrowed melodic elements from the Ronde Infernale from Night on Mount Triglav in his own exploration of Russia's Gashche the Deathless myth in The Firebird. This is hardly surprising, since Stravinsky was, in fact, one of Rimsky-Korsakov's students, but more on him later. Rimsky-Korsakov had a work ethic that bordered on the obsessive, and when inspiration failed him, he would often busy himself by tidying up works from his youth. This habit accounts for the proliferation of versions of our next Halloween work, the symphonic work entitled Antar. This work was composed between January and August 1868, premiering in March of the following year. After a few alterations, it was published in 1880 as his Second Symphony. However, in the new edition of 1903, which was dated 1897, Antar was substantially revised and called a symphonic suite, with the words Second Symphony in a parenthetical subtitle. In 1913, a final version of Antar came out called simply a symphonic suite, as Rimsky-Korsakov had decided that Antar was a poem, suite, fairy tale, story, anything you like, but not a symphony. The final version changes the key of the second movement and has more refined and detailed orchestration. However, the earlier version may best preserve the freshness of Rimsky-Korsakov's response to the myth of Antar, a great warrior from Arab literature. We include Antar in Oriental Halloween because of its invocation of supernatural elements. Antar's opposite in the story is the Queen of Palmyra, Gulnazar. Just as he is an epic warrior, she is a sorceress who wields enormous magical power. She can turn herself into other forms, and Antar recognizes her ability to kill him with her magic as well. So, while we don't have any direct references to Halloween per se, we do have supernatural elements, death, and doomed love. Another reflection of Russian composers' fascination with the exotic East. Rimsky-Korsakov's program opens with Antar, wandering the ruins of the ancient desert city of Palmyra. Rimsky-Korsakov portrays the desert with grim, bare woodwind chords and elusive chromatic fragments of melody sweeping over them. Antar's theme enters on the strings in a lush, resigned harmonization, as he has come to the desert to renounce humanity. Suddenly, a beautiful gazelle appears, which Antar chases. A huge black bird swoops down on the gazelle, but Antar repels it with his lance. He then falls asleep. In his dream, he meets the Queen of Palmyra, Gulnazar, who had taken the form of the gazelle that Antar saved. The queen is represented by a lovely, winding wind theme. Gulnazar promises Antar the 3 joys of life in exchange for his good deed. As Antar contemplates his newfound good fortune, he wakes up to the strains of the harp and the Gulnazar theme amid the ruins of Palmyra. So ends the first movement. The second and third movements are devoted to depicting the joys of vengeance and power, respectively. Rimsky-Korsakov uses nervous tremolos in the strings and puts the Antar theme in defiant brass to suggest vengeance, while it is played sweetly on the strings and in fanfares by the brass to depict power. In the final movement, Antar is allowed to experience the ultimate joy, the love of Queen Gulnazar. He insists that she kill him when she feels his passion cooling. This she does, and Antar dies in her arms. This movement features some of Rimsky-Korsakov's finest orchestration, including transcendently poignant blends in the woodwinds, which depict the two lovers as their passion swells and fades, ultimately ascending to heaven on a swirling harp and lying to rest with a few final chords. anyone who enjoys Scheherazade should try Antar next, as this symphony is almost as inspired as that peak of Rimsky-Korsakov's symphonic output. Unlike his predecessor, Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov had no difficulty bridging the gap between Western cosmopolitanism and Eastern folk traditions. Likewise, he saw no contradiction in embracing Western ideas, even as he promoted Eastern exoticism. Thus, we can enjoy his music for religious holidays, even as we appreciate his more secular works such as Flight of the Bumblebee and Scheherazade. Aside from the lovely music I have covered in this presentation, I want to remind you that Rimsky-Korsakov was not only a brilliant composer and a loyal friend, but he was also important in his ability to teach. Our next presentation will continue our Halloween section with dark works by two such students, Anatol Lyadov and Ottorino Respighi. See you next time, when you get to hear the macabre works by some of Rimsky-Korsakov's students. You will love these works as much as you would those by Rimsky-Korsakov. Remember to comment, subscribe, and keep listening. Ah!